I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to Botanical Storyteller Amanda Edmiston. Amanda trained in herbalism and has an encyclopaedic knowledge of historical plants and botanical figures. But in this episode, we focus mainly on what Amanda does and her work around Elizabeth Blackwell's book, A Curious Herbal. So I thought we'd start, if we can, with you just talking a little bit about, well, what you do and why you chose to do it.
So I started storytelling about 10 years ago now. I'd been studying herbal medicine at university level, and I'd had my daughter, my eldest, and I needed to find a kind of way of earning a living, but that actually was creative and fitted in around looking after a small child. And I didn't really feel drawn to going into clinical practice. So I was basically sort of footering around being a mum with a 2-year-old, and we had a lovely toddler group in a hidden garden in Glasgow, and their remit was to work in the sort of most diverse cultural community in Glasgow. So there were people from, I think at one point, 13 different countries, parents and grandparents and small children. And they started to ask the parents to do voluntary sessions, start finding a way to kind of connect quite disparate communities with really varied backgrounds, but using this beautiful garden space. There was a small birch wood, there were laid out herb gardens in raised beds, there were beautiful wildflower meadows, structured areas with sculpture in them, and a big lawn, all in a really small area, but huge range of plants, and very safe in a walled area so that, you know, small children could play. So I decided, well, my mum had been a storyteller for around 20 years at this point, and I'd really always connected with stories. My family sort of mostly have a background in some form of art or writing or sort of creative process. My maternal grandfather was a sculptor, and he always told me stories about the landscape or about why he'd made a sculpture or the history behind the figure he was portraying. And I had kind of I almost thought in stories from a very early age. My mum's mum was a keen gardener. Her family were all involved in plants in some way. Her father had been English Romany, and his mother had had a really tough time of it, from what we can gather from kind of fairly minimal family records. But he had actually decided to work until he could buy himself a farm and become a fruit farmer. So my mum had huge, brilliant, vivid memories of being taken to her grandfather, my great-grandfather's fruit farm when she was little, and climbing cherry trees and all this sort of thing. And their children, my great aunts and uncles, an awful lot of them were involved in something to do with plants. So one became a market gardener, one was a greengrocer. They really connected with plants. So when I needed to find something to do that was paid way of earning a living with a small child as a single parent, and I was working in this beautiful hidden garden, and I was asked to do voluntary sessions, storytelling and sort of sharing folklore and uses of plants, whether it's traditional herbal use or cooking, felt like a very natural option. And people really, really enjoyed it. I found that the very diverse range of countries that the parents came from, the plants were something that connected them all. So if you could mention cinnamon and that incredible sort of aroma is so evocative for just everyone from many different parts of the world, and became a common bond because they could talk about cakes they remembered from childhood, or walking in a wood and the smell reminding them of bark, or, despite having really different backgrounds, plants would bring people together and they would enjoy sharing the uses. The garden then got a small amount of funding and paid me to do a run of sessions, a sort of small residency, if you like. And then I was asked to partner up that residency with the Hidden Gardens in Glasgow, with Chelsea Physic Garden in London, and tie in spice stories that I had collected from mainly the Indian and Pakistani women in the toddler group, and then tying those stories and finding connections with Scottish stories. I was asked to go down and do spice stories for Chelsea Physic Garden for a spice weekend. When I got back, the Scottish Ballet had caught up on my work. They worked in a nearby building and someone had seen some of my stuff, and they asked me to do a small video film for their education department and write a version of Sleeping Beauty for them. And that kind of gave me the start, if you like, to think this is something I could do. This really connects people. People really love it and it resonates with them. And this is what I do with my knowledge of plants, is I take that incredible sort of visceral love I have of plants that is kind of channeled through stories and folklore, but tied into tastes and smells and the feel of plants, if you like. And then I share that back out to people and engage them with that. And it just took off from there.
Lovely
story to a short result, but
No, it sounds brilliant. But when you were talking, it made me wonder, is it universal, or do you find that some people have more childhood memories, for example, of plants? I'm just thinking, if you came from a really urban background, would you have as many resources to draw on? And I'm thinking also of that book, I think it's called The Lost Words, isn't it? Where, a lot of children don't have that nature vocabulary. Have you found that, or is there always something that you can tap into?
I think that The Lost Words, I have a copy. It's absolutely stunning. And I've taken it out to work with care homes when I've been doing reminiscence work with care homes, sharing plant stories. I think that, yes, it's based on an actual fact. I think there are children that are growing up with incredibly urban lifestyles that have forgotten this. But my experience, and I have told in schools, in very urban areas, in areas sometimes with quite high levels of deprivation, and I usually can find a way to engage them. I think that there is something about the stories, and as a professional storyteller, you respond very much to the audience. So I know I have a way of walking around where I'm about to work. And part of the process I go through when I'm walking is looking to see what plants there are and how the plant life copes with the surroundings. So you start to spot a dandelion that, despite its concrete surrounds, that taproot can go deep down into the earth. And you connect with the plants that are there. And then people know that the storytelling is about their space. It's not alienating them. It's not some space that they don't have any access to. You connect it into their space. And that like the dandelion root opening up a crack in the ground, is a bit like the opening into this world of plants. I also have some great stories that I know that there are specific groups that, there are age groups like upper primary, early secondary find it hard to give up the cool, if you like. They don't really like to fess up to, they just want to sit under a tree and fiddle around with a bit of grass anymore. That you might get 5 and 6-year-olds making daisy chains and blowing dandelion clocks. Your average 13-year-old in a city child probably would like doing that, but they're reluctant to admit to it in front of their peer group sometimes, not always. But I have stories about great scary things, horrendous stories of accidental poisonings, or always go down well, or creepy stories where people are they're almost superhero-like in their structure, but they're actually really ancient traditional stories that involve outwitting the devil, or and connecting in with the plant lore, at which point even the most reluctant hip teenager is usually with you by the end. I have a session that I've been introducing people that maybe do feel a bit alienated by, based on the true story of the confectioner that accidentally poisoned everyone with a mint humbug. And I offer them all a humbug before I tell them about the poisoning with the humbug, regardless of age. Adults and children all totally love that, and they all love the fact they might have accidentally been poisoned by a minty sweetie. You've got a pot of mint in there with that. It opens up their interest. And so I think that, yes, there is a risk that the knowledge isn't there so much anymore, even working with rural schools, because quite a lot of our rural areas are, it's a very gross generalisation, but a lot more people are commuting from rural areas now, that maybe the entrenched knowledge that's handed down from generations is not there so much. But if you tell people about it, and you tell them a really good story about it, and you let them taste and try, and there's a bit of risk and excitement involved in that, then the connection is very much still there. I think it's ingrained in us, actually. I think that you just need to open up the potential that's already there.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work with Elizabeth Blackwell's book, A Curious Herbal.
Yeah.
That does get bandied about a little bit on Twitter. There are a lot of people who are interested in horticulture that love that book. So why did you choose it? And can you maybe pick one of your favourite plants to talk about from the book?
Sure. I was asked to create a bespoke workshop for the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, and they wanted an afternoon full-day workshop looking at their history, but building on my plant stories along a sort of I developed a big timeline full of stories for them. But I got to research in their library, and they have some incredible books in there. I mean, they've got an original copy of Audubon's Book of Birds, which, if anyone's ever encountered it, it's a huge, beautifully painted book of birds. They also have an incredible collection of herbals, which some of them date back to the college's early days. It was founded by a sort of three men. One was an apothecary, one was a surgeon, one was a physician. And so in amongst these herbals, I came across Elizabeth Blackwell's A Curious Herbal, the original 1737 edition. And in many ways, it could have been overlooked, because it's not as gaudy, or as a lot of the herbals maybe that are slightly later, or as peculiar, if you like, as some of the earlier ones. The hortus, which is 16th century, often gets waved around with its anatomically correct pictures of tiny man-shaped mandrake roots, waiting to be foisted from the ground and kill their assailant off. Elizabeth Blackwell's drawings are quite pared down, but they are incredibly accurate. When I say pared down, the detail of the individual plants is very much still there. And it's one of the first books that you can accurately, it's a bit big for a field guide, but you could have taken it out, and if you didn't know a plant, you could correctly identify it using Blackwell's books, which is quite a rare thing for the early 18th century. It also has the illustrations are the key part. So there's an awful lot of text in a lot of earlier herbals, and that's great, but there is something really accessible about those beautiful, accurate pictures that you could use. Now, I then found out she was from Aberdeen, the same place I'm from, and that she had she'd decided to create her herbal when she was on her own with her young son, as I had been with my eldest daughter before I met my husband. And she had to find a way to earn a living to support herself and her child. Her husband had squandered her dowry, her money. We didn't have the thing in Scotland where your husband owns your belongings. That was very much an English law. So even though they'd run off to London because his medical credentials had been questioned, it would still have been Elizabeth's money. Her father was a wealthy stocking merchant, and she set him up in a printing business. He then got into trouble. He didn't have the appropriate apprenticeship, and he's thrown in Highgate Debtors' Jail. She then had to find a way to support herself and her child. And instead of doing what many of us would be, forgiven for doing, which is turning around, going back to her mum and dad's, she actually started walking the gardens at Chelsea Physic Garden. She put to Sir Hans Sloane, who owned the garden, and Philip Rand, the garden director. Hans Sloane was renting it out basically as his estate still does, to the Royal Society of Apothecaries. And she put to them that she was going to create a herbal with lifelike illustrations of plants. Now, there's this incredible story because Sir Hans Sloane was an eminent plant collector. His collection is one of the things that started the Natural History Museum, as well as Chelsea Physic Garden. He had been employed as a doctor out in the Americas, albeit in a fairly trying and difficult period of history. At this point, Glasgow's wealth was built on the sugar barons. Our relationship with the West Indies was, built on slavery and abuse. But at the same point, Sir Hans Sloane was out there as a doctor, and he clearly spoke to a great range of people, because he brings back recipes for things like chocolate, which are not, this is a different culture. This is not a white elite passing on these recipes. He does bring back Spanish recipes for using tomatoes, and Elizabeth Blackwell, having never been, starts drawing these plants. She not only draws the nettles and dandelions that she would have seen from her childhood in Scotland, and no doubt covering London in those days, she sees these plants, some of them grown in the UK for the very first time, chocolate, and tomatoes, which, people, I'm no longer surprised by the fact that nobody eats tomatoes in the 18th century. That was news to me so long ago. I've forgotten that it still is new to some people, but the British didn't eat tomatoes in the 18th century. In fact, we very much adhered to the Germanic Northern European myth that tomatoes were poisonous, being related to the being one of the Atropa family, so related to belladonna, mandrake, henbane. And she talks about tomatoes. She mentions that they're eaten in Italy, Spain, with dressing like we do cucumbers. But at the same point, the mass feeling about tomatoes in the UK is this one of fear. It was believed that witches used tomatoes to turn their enemies into werewolves. It's just, this is a fantastic period of history that she's working in. Middle-class women didn't work for a living. She's very middle class. She's doing this to survive and bring up her child. She gets accredited by these two huge male establishment bodies, the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal Society of Apothecaries. She does the whole thing to support her child, and she's drawing plants that have never before been seen in Britain, but in a way that could be identified by anyone walking along the street. So she's taking that bit of information that maybe only these very elite people might have seen and sharing it in a book. Now, there's also a twist, because she creates her book episodically to, reporters always say she does this so to give herself a steady income. And I don't doubt that for a minute. But whether knowingly or not, she also makes it accessible, because she keeps the price down, because she does one a week. So you could have bought it like a newspaper or a magazine. So at the point that medicine is being taken from being, it's a few hundred years where this is going on. This is a, constantly changing situation. But medicine is more and more, this is the end of the witch hunts. So, she's born about the same time the last witch in Aberdeen is put to trial. Witchcraft is not entirely revoked until just before her book comes out. So she'll be in her nearly 30 by that point, or in her 30s. And this is a different time, so information is being taken out of the hands of the common people and being turned into a more structured form of medicine that requires more qualifications, more sort of assessment by an establishment. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but the shift in information is fascinating. So as soon as I twigged that her book was published in 1737, so the end of the witch trials, in a time that Mary Wollstonecraft, end of 60, 70 years later, is described by a vicar as encouraging women into the unhealthy area of botany, that he thinks it's incredibly unseemly for women to be engaging in botany, and he thinks there's nothing more abhorrent than the thought of boys and girls botanizing together. But, this is 60 years after Blackwell has published a herbal that has been accepted by the medical establishment. So, she's doing something much more risky, much more risque than we often give her credit for. And then there was a huge period of time in the 60s, really quite well-respected commentators on botanical illustration sort of write her work off as, nice flower drawings, not very exciting. But the point is that they don't need to be exciting. What they are is accurate, and they're sharing information. There's another great myth as well. And as soon as I saw the book, and I had this really deep personal connection to her, and I kind of felt this is a woman whose paths I keep crossing, whether it was in Chelsea Physic Garden, where we'd both started off our professional careers, or whether it was place where we were born, then it's, there was something really compelling about that. But I also immediately thought, hang on a minute, this is, she's been overlooked and written off as as not having the value if you look at what she does in the correct period of time. There's this other thing, this is where I was heading with that she, for years, everyone has said she took the book in and her husband wrote the words from his prison cell, which I have very little evidence about this, other than anyone I've said it to, including the staff and, the people down at Chelsea Physic Garden, that I've said, now, no one's put this out there yet, but I'm going to say this now. I do not think for a minute that she, went across to Highgate from Chelsea to get her husband to write the words in prison when she was spending every single day drawing and talking to apothecaries and doctors in Chelsea Physic Garden who had an extensive library and all the books that she quotes from, Gerard and Culpeper and people like that. She'd collect gets plant samples from the University of Leiden, which was the leading medical hospital at the time. My friend Elizabeth Brooks, the herbalist and author, has also said we've had a conversation. She has some evidence that Elizabeth Blackwell probably studied midwifery with workshops with William Smiley, and certainly she talks about midwifery herbs in a way that doesn't sound like someone who didn't know. She's not getting someone else to write those words. I think that myth grew up in order for them to be able to sell the book, the publishing rights to the book later on, which they did. And she does that when she's about to go and join her husband out in Sweden. That goes horribly wrong. That's another of his bad ideas. Because, as you probably know, he ends up executed and is implicated in a plot that they think he was part of the Jacobite rebellion, and is implicated in a plot to overthrow the Swedish throne or change the lineage of the Swedish throne. And she doesn't ever go to Sweden, and we kind of lose track of her there. So the book I've been working on for a little while now. Although it's not entirely a biography of Blackwell, it's more about the plants and the stories, like the werewolf story with the tomatoes. Those all thread into it. But one of the things I do is link the plant stories up to and maybe what happens to her after we lose track of her. We do know she's buried at Chelsea Old Parish Church and next to Sir Hans and Lady Sloane. And I mean, there are so many little nuances and different narratives into the plant world that flow through my project, The Very Curious Herbal. We'd be here for months, because coffee is just coming to the country, chocolate's just come into the country, and we've got all those incredible spices from India, and some things like tamarind, which is African, and turmeric, and it's alongside nettles and dandelions. So I just had this encounter with a book, found out her story, fell a bit in love, and had to keep I keep uncovering new connections every chapter I write.
Yeah, I bet you do. Actually, out of interest, when you were talking about it, I wondered, do you know what came first? Was it the idea that tomatoes turn people into werewolves, or was it the name lycopene? Does one precede the other?
I think the werewolf thing precedes the lycopene, because there is a interesting row goes on pretty much whilst Elizabeth is working. She just about predates Linnaeus, but where one sort of faction is calling it the love apple. So it's Pomodorus. I can't think what its second name is, and I should know. It might be Pomodorus solanium. And she refers to it as a love apple in her book, but the Lycopodium persicum is the other option that was argued over, the wolf peach, Latin for the wolf peach, and that probably is connected into that werewolf legend, and the lycopene then comes from that. And in my storytelling, in the sessions, the Very Curious Herbal sessions, and in the manuscript that is hopefully becoming a book, I do explore that name, the wolf peach, as my herbalist. The herbalist in me wants to connect that to what we describe as an inflammatory cascade. Many people realise that some things, that family, the Solanium, I can never say that word, Solanium family, can be quite inflammatory. So potatoes, aubergines, tomatoes, and the inflammation can aggravate things sometimes like eczema or digestive disturbance, but also things like PMT. And for me, there's a real light bulb moment where I go, ooh, inflammation and werewolves. Because, anything that inflames you in an energetic medicine, we often see as having that potential to make people hot and angry, and whether that's hot, angry skin or hot, angry temper. I wonder if there's a little connection there that from my point of view is quite intriguing, and that's what I do with a lot of my work. That's why I describe myself as a herbal storyteller, and where the name Botanica Fabula came from, because any story I tell, I try and extract how that story relates, how we use the plants, whether it's in food, medicine, even simple games sometimes, or sayings, things like that, or social history, that I try and tell stories that there is a aspect of truth hidden in them. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons, back to what you were saying earlier, that people find it easy to connect, because it lifts it out from being just a fairy story. There's like a hidden fact, and people like following that through. And, even very young children will turn around to me and say, that story is teaching me something, that, I've learned the science hidden in there somewhere, people immediately recognize it as a way we might have been taught things in pre-literate times and handed on information. So I think that's kind of where my notion of herbal storytelling threads through everything I do, really.
Thanks to Amanda for taking part in the podcast. Do go and check out her website. She's telling stories from the A Curious Herbal project at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, in October as part of the Scottish International Storytelling Festival. And she does travel throughout the UK and internationally for work, so get in touch if you'd like to book her for an event as well. I actually interviewed Amanda a while back, and for reasons to do with getting a good balance of topics, I've waited until now to release the episode, and I think the timing is perfect. I've been listening to people who have struggled with returning to work, or with returning to the office, with a return to the norm, and sometimes even with leaving the house since the lockdown has been lifted. Amanda's story is interesting because she chose a job that worked for her, that fit around her circumstances, and that allowed her to follow her passion. And it's a job that some may be surprised to find even exists, and that's the beauty of horticulture. There are so many overlaps with other fields and so many jobs that can be done that involve it. I think many of us have tasted a different life since the beginning of the year, and I hope some of you have decided that actually the old grind isn't what you want. I also know many people, and I include myself among them, who've stepped off the roundabout and followed a different path. It isn't always easy, it isn't always comfortable, but it does give you the freedom to live in a way so far removed from the conventional that you'll wonder how you ever did it, and you'll know that you'll never go back. To round off the episode, I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a nightmarish insect that could probably feature in one of Amanda's stories.
It's strange to think that a fly would intentionally cause a mid-air collision with a bee or a wasp, but that's exactly what the female Conopid flies do. Conopids are commonly known as thick-headed flies, and have evolved to look remarkably like small stripy wasps. But, unlike wasps, they only have one pair of wings. You can often see conopids on flowers where they're innocently feeding on nectar. However, there's a dark side to a conopid's life, since they are deadly parasites of bees and wasps. The mid-air collision that the female conopids cause is actually a carefully coordinated process for them to insert an egg into the chosen victim. Remarkably, their egg-laying organ is like a can opener, which in a microsecond prises open a soft area of the victim's body and deposits an egg inside. In a flash, the deed is done, and the conopid has gone. The unfortunate victim will continue to go about its business, whilst within its body, the conopid's egg hatches into a tiny maggot. The maggot begins feeding on the victim's internal organs and rapidly grows, eventually pupating within the now empty body cavity, where in a few days' time, a fresh new adult Conopid fly will emerge.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.